While I was recovering in a hospital bed, my wife walked in with divorce papers and said, "I can't live like this anymore." She called me a burden. She said I was finished. I signed without a word. Then the doctor entered with news that changed everything. Her face lost all color. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. The first thing Wade Turner heard every morning was the beep. Steady, mechanical, indifferent. It counted out the seconds of his life with the same cold rhythm, whether he was asleep or awake, healing or hurting. After 3 weeks inside McCurtain Memorial Hospital, that sound had become more familiar to him than his own heartbeat. He knew its pace better than he knew the sound of the lake at dawn, and that was saying something, because Broken Bow Lake had been the soundtrack of his life since he was 9 years old. He lay still in the narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling tile above him. His right shoulder was wrapped thick with bandaging. His ribs ached in a dull, persistent way that made every breath feel like a negotiation. The doctors said the shrapnel from the engine explosion had been surgical in its cruelty, tearing through muscle and bone in patterns that would require months of careful healing. They also said he was lucky. Lucky because the metal hadn't caught an artery. Lucky because the kid beside him, his teenage shop assistant Denny, had walked away with nothing worse than a bruised arm and a story he'd be telling for the rest of his life. Lucky was not quite the word Wade would have chosen. He didn't feel lucky. He felt like a man who had done the necessary thing at the necessary moment and was now dealing with the cost of it, which is the honest accounting of most difficult decisions. He had no regret. He had discomfort and limited mobility and a hospital food tray that appeared every morning like a small punishment, but he had no regret. The nurses had been good. The doctor, a quiet man named Breland who had the deliberate gentleness of someone who has spent years delivering news to people lying in beds, had been clear and thorough and honest about the timeline. 3 months minimum before the shoulder would handle real work. The ribs would determine their own schedule. He had given Wade a series of exercises to begin in the second week and had been visibly satisfied when Wade followed them without needing reminding. Wade had pushed Denny clear. He hadn't even thought about it. The engine had started running rough, then rougher. Then there was a sound like the world tearing open, and his body had moved on instinct. One hard shove that sent the boy stumbling backward off the work platform, away from the blast. Wade took the full force of it. He didn't regret it. He would do it again without hesitation. That was the kind of man he was. Quiet about it, too. He hadn't told that story himself. It came out through Denny, through the paramedics, through Calvin, who had arrived at the shop 20 minutes after the explosion and found Wade sitting against the dock wall, with blood soaking through his shirt, completely calm, asking if the boy was okay before he asked about his own injuries. The pain had been manageable those first few days. Adrenaline does that. It lets you feel like you're holding together right up until the moment everything hits at once, and then the body presents its bill in full. Now, 3 weeks in, the pain was honest and constant, and Wade had made his peace with it. He was sleeping more than he ever had in his life, drinking bad hospital coffee from a styrofoam cup, and waiting for the slow machinery of his body to do its work. Brandy stood near the window. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her phone, her thumb moving in that absent, automatic way it always did when she wasn't interested in what was happening around her. She had been in the room for maybe 20 minutes. She'd brought nothing, no food, no book, none of the small things people bring to hospital rooms to show they care. She wore a light blue top he recognized and dark jeans, and her hair was done, which struck him as an odd detail, because it was a Tuesday afternoon and she hadn't been to work in months. Wade watched her. He didn't say anything. He had learned over 15 years of marriage that Brandy would get to whatever she had come to say in her own time and in her own way, and pushing her only made her dig in. The monitor beeped. Outside the window, an October sky sat flat and pale over the pine trees. The leaves on the hardwoods had started turning, red and amber burning through the green. "I can't keep living like this," Brandy said. Her voice was flat, not shaking, not building toward emotion, just flat, the way someone sounds when they've already made a decision and are going through the remaining steps as a formality. Wade didn't move. Living like what? She looked up from her phone then, and her eyes met his, and he saw something in them he had never quite been able to name in 15 years of trying. Not cruelty, not coldness, something closer to a calculation that had finally finished running. With a man who can't provide, she said. The room was very quiet except for the beeping. Wade looked at her for a long moment. He thought, not for the first time, that she was a beautiful woman. He had thought that the first time he saw her at a mutual friend's cookout near the lake, standing in the grass with a red Solo cup, laughing at something with her head thrown back. He had thought it on their wedding day, when the light caught her face through the church windows. He had thought it on hard days and easy ones, all through the years, even when things between them were complicated. He thought it now, lying in a hospital bed with shrapnel damage in his shoulder, and it meant nothing to him at all. I paid every bill, he said quietly, for 15 years. You're going to be out of work for months. I was injured saving someone's life. I know that. Her tone didn't change, but I have to think about my future. He almost asked her what future she had been thinking about. He almost asked when the thinking had started. He almost said a lot of things that rose up inside him like water behind a cracked dam. He let them go, one by one, let them sink back down. Brandy reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope. She crossed the room and set it on the rolling tray beside his bed, next to the half-finished cup of coffee, next to the small plastic cup of pills the nurse had brought an hour ago. Divorce papers. I already talked to a lawyer, she said. Wade looked at the envelope. Then he looked up at her face. She was watching him the way you watch something you expect to react, waiting for the argument, the pleading, the anger, the tears. He could see her ready for it, braced against it. He reached over with his good arm, picked up the pen from the tray, and signed where the tabs indicated. His hand was steady. Brandy stared at the papers for a beat. Then she looked at him, and something moved across her face. Not guilt, exactly, but the slight discomfort of a person who has rehearsed a scene and found the other actor went off script. That's all you have to say? She asked. Yes, Wade said. She picked up the envelope. She put it back in her bag. She looked at him one more time, and he held her gaze completely still, the way you hold yourself when the worst thing has already happened and there's nothing left to brace for. And then she walked out. The door swung shut behind her. The monitor beeped. 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 Wade turned his head toward the window and watched the pine trees stand against the pale sky and said nothing, felt nothing that he would allow to surface, because some things you store away in a sealed place where they can't do damage, and you learn to leave them there. 2 hours later, a nurse came in with a different kind of news. She said a man from a Tulsa law office had called. She handed Wade a number written on a piece of notepaper. He didn't know yet. He held the paper and thought it was probably a billing matter or some distant legal complication from the shop. He set on the tray and went back to watching the trees, and the October sky darkened slowly from pale gray to the deep purple of an Oklahoma evening, and the monitor kept its count. A week after Brandy moved her things into an apartment on the east side of town. He heard about it from Calvin, who heard it from the woman at the post office. Wade was moved out of intensive care into a recovery room with a window that faced a parking lot. Progress, the doctors called it. He made the call to the Tulsa law office on a Thursday morning. The attorney's name was Garrett Ellis, and he had a slow, careful voice that lawyers seem to develop when they spend a lot of years delivering life-changing information to people sitting in uncomfortable chairs. He spoke about Wade's Uncle Harold Turner. He spoke about Harold dying of a heart attack in Tulsa 2 hours after Brandy had left the hospital room on the day she served the papers. Wade had not known Harold well. The man was his father's older brother, a quiet, private man who had built a career supplying equipment to the oil industry and who had never married, never had children, and had apparently spent the last 30 years of his life building something substantial and telling no one about it. Wade had seen Harold at 4 funerals and 2 Thanksgivings over the last 2 decades. They shook hands. They talked briefly about weather, about fishing, about the way Broken Bow had changed. Harold always asked about the shop. He seemed to respect, in his quiet way, the fact that Wade had built something with his hands. Garrett Ellis explained the terms of the will in plain language. Oil royalties, land leases, a portfolio of conservative investments that had compounded quietly for years while the man who owned them lived simply and spent very little. Harold Turner had been the kind of man who needed very little from a day. A good meal, the news, a quiet evening. He had worked hard for 40 years and built something real and told nobody about it. And now it was Wade's, every bit of it, because Harold had looked at his nephew across a few short visits over 2 decades and seen something he recognized and decided to trust. Total value, just over $3.8 million. Wade sat on the edge of the hospital bed in the recovery room, holding the phone against his good ear, looking at the parking lot through the window. A woman was trying to get a stroller out of the back of an SUV. A man in scrubs was walking fast toward the entrance, coffee in hand. The world outside the window was completely normal. It had no idea what had just changed inside this room, and that ordinary indifference was its own strange comfort. "Mr. Turner," Garrett Ellis said. "Are you still there?" "Yes," Wade said. "I'm here. I understand this is a lot to absorb." "It is," Wade said. "Thank you for calling me directly." There was a pause. "Your uncle spoke about you," Ellis said, with the careful tone of a man offering something personal in a professional context. "He said you were the kind of man who built things that lasted. He wanted to go to someone like that." Wade absorbed this. He said nothing for a moment. He wasn't sitting in shock because of the money, though the scale of it was hard to immediately grasp. He was sitting in a kind of profound, crystalline stillness because of the timing, because of the 48 hours that separated these two events, because Brandy had stood in that hospital room, looked at her husband with shrapnel damage in his shoulder, placed divorce papers on the tray beside him, and said the words, "You can't provide," and then walked out 2 hours before this inheritance landed. 2 hours. He thought about how she had said it. Flat. Certain. Already decided. He thought about the specific expression on her face when she had expected him to argue and found nothing but silence. He thought about the 15 years of bills paid and problems solved and the boutique funded and the deck built and the car fixed and the 100 small commitments honored without fanfare or complaint. He thought about the way none of it had ever been enough to make her feel secure, because the insecurity was not about money at all. He did not call her. He thanked Garrett Ellis, took down the address of the firm, and said he would be in touch once he was released from the hospital. He set the phone on the bed beside him and sat there for a while in the quiet room, in the still October light, and whatever grief or rage was moving underneath the surface of him, he kept it there. Below the surface, where it could be managed, where it could be useful. He had work to do. First, he had to heal. Broken Bow, Oklahoma, is not a large town. Its permanent population sits comfortably in the low thousands, swelling in the summer months when the lake brings visitors from Dallas and Oklahoma City and beyond. But in the off-season, in the gray weeks of November when the tourist rentals go dark and the restaurants cut their hours, the town folds back into itself like a book closing. In a town that size, privacy is not impossible, but it requires real effort. Brandy was not making that effort. By December, 2 months after she had filed and moved out, everyone who worked within 3 blocks of Wade's shop knew that Brandy Turner had moved in with Colton Rivas. Calvin told Wade on a quiet Monday morning when the shop was still closed for Wade's recovery. The two of them standing in the parking lot while Wade did the slow walking his physical therapist had prescribed. Calvin Briggs was Wade's shop foreman, a thick-necked, sunburned man of 52 who had worked with Wade since almost the beginning. He was not a man who enjoyed carrying news, and Wade could tell by the way he held his coffee and looked sideways at the tree lean that he had been deciding whether to say anything at all. "You're going to hear it one way or another," Calvin finally said. "I know," Wade said and kept walking. "She's living with Colton Rivas." Calvin said it like a man delivering a diagnosis. Over on Pine Ridge. Wade didn't react. He kept his pace even, his breathing steady. 3 steps, breathe. 3 steps, breathe. The physical therapist had told him to count in his head, keep focus on the breath, not the pain. "He's got gambling debts," Calvin continued, watching Wade's face for something. "Inedible, mostly. Owes money to a couple of people you wouldn't want to owe money to. And there've been," he paused, choosing words, "people have heard things. From that neighborhood." "What kind of things?" "Shouting. Not just arguing, the kind of shouting where neighbors think about calling somebody." Wade absorbed this. He kept walking. He thought about Brandy's face when she had placed those papers on the tray. the absolute certainty in her eyes, the complete confidence that she was stepping away from something diminishing and towards something better. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't share the thought with Calvin. He simply filed it in the same sealed place where he kept everything else. "Thank you for telling me," Wade said. Calvin nodded and drank his coffee and didn't say anything more. Through December and into the new year, Wade healed. He was methodical about it in the same way he had always been methodical about everything. Showing up to every physical therapy session, doing the prescribed exercises even when they were uncomfortable, tracking his progress in a small notebook he kept on his nightstand. His shoulder came back slowly. His ribs, which take their own time, came back more slowly. He had stopped drinking during the recovery because he didn't want anything blurring the process. He cooked simple meals in the house he and Brandy had shared, the house that was now entirely his, and he ate at the kitchen table and looked out through the sliding glass door at the dock and the dark water of the lake beyond. He noticed her absence mostly in practical ways. The absence of the television going in the other room in the evenings, the absence of the specific smell of her shampoo in the bathroom, the absence of the sounder car made pulling into the driveway. These are not griefs exactly. They were more like the echo of a noise that has stopped, the slight adjustment a room makes when something large has been moved out of it. He thought occasionally about the early years. The first winter they had spent in this house, when it was not yet finished, and they cooked dinner on a single burner and slept under 3 blankets because the heating system was still being connected. Brandy had found it charming then, or had performed finding it charming in a way that had seemed genuine to him. She had sat across from him at a folding table in a half-built kitchen and laughed at something he said, and the lamplight had made her face warm and close. And he had thought, this is enough. All of it. This is exactly enough. He didn't know when enough had stopped being enough for her. He wasn't sure it mattered anymore. What he knew was that the version of their life he had invested 15 years building had been, in some fundamental way, a structure only he had been maintaining. He had kept showing up for it, kept paying for it, kept believing in it, and she had tolerated it, comfortably, conveniently, right up until the moment she decided there was something better available. He focused on what was present, the healing, the work ahead, the future that was taking shape. He hired Dana Whitlock in January. Dana was 50 years old and had been practicing family law in McCurtain County for over 2 decades. She had a reputation that preceded her by several rooms. Judges respected her. Opposing counsel feared her in the particular way people fear someone who is never the loudest person in the room, but always the most prepared. Her office was in a brick building on Main Street, modest in appearance, wood paneling, practical furniture, framed diplomas behind a desk that was organized with surgical precision. She listened to Wade's situation without interrupting. He laid it out the way he laid out everything, in order, with precision, without editorializing. The marriage, the shop, the accident, the papers, the timing of the inheritance, the separate accounts he had maintained. When he finished, she looked at him steadily and said, "You kept the inheritance completely separate from any joint assets?" "From the day I learned about it," Wade said. "My own account, my own attorney for the estate. I was careful." Dana wrote something on her notepad. "Oklahoma law is clear on inheritance. It is separate property unless the inheriting spouse commingling it with marital assets. If you kept it clean, she has no legitimate claim." "I know," Wade said. Dana looked up. "Then what do you need me for?" "I need someone who knows how to win a courtroom," he said, "because she's going to file something. I know how she thinks. She found out about the money, and she's going to file something." Dana looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote his name at the top of a new page. "Let's get to work," she said. Spring came to Broken Bow the way it always does, gradually, then suddenly. The pine trees didn't need to announce it because they were evergreen year-round, but the hardwoods came back with a rush, and the lake turned from its winter gray to something warmer, something that held the light of late afternoon in a way that reminded Wade why he had never wanted to leave this place. He had been back at the shop since February, working shortened hours at first, then building back to full days. His shoulder had healed enough for light work. His ribs were finally quiet. The physical therapist had cleared him with the kind of cautious optimism medical people develop when a patient has cooperated completely with their instructions. The shop felt good, real. The smell of oil and lake water and machine grease was its own kind of medicine. He had spent the slow months of recovery planning some updates, and now he was putting them into motion. New equipment, better organization in the storage bay, a drainage system in the main work floor that had needed replacing for 3 years. Small things, solid things, the kind of improvement that comes from having clear eyes and time to think. He had also been working quietly with an estate manager connected to Garrett Ellis's firm, making sure the inherited assets were correctly structured, properly documented, and entirely separate from everything else he owned. He had been careful to the point of obsession. He had not moved $1 of Harold's money into his personal accounts. Not $1. The local paper, the McCurtain Gazette, ran a small business feature in late April. It was the kind of story small-town papers do to fill space in the slow weeks between news cycles. A profile of a local business owner, a feel-good piece about community. The reporter was a young woman named Felicia who had interviewed Wade briefly at the shop. She was interested in his recovery story, the accident, the fact that he had used the recovery period to plan upgrades. Wade had not mentioned the inheritance. He had answered her questions about the shop, but Garrett Ellis's name appeared in the article in connection with the estate because Felicia had done some courthouse record research the way young journalists with time on their hands sometimes do. The headline read, "Local marine shop owner inherits family oil interests." It was a 2-column story buried on page 4. Most people wouldn't have seen it at all. Brandy saw it. He knew she had seen it because she showed up at his house on a Thursday evening in late April, 6 months after she had walked out of his hospital room. He was on the back porch, sanding a section of deck railing that had started to splinter over the winter. The sun was still up, barely, painting the surface of broken bow like the color of copper. He heard the front door. He heard footsteps, not the front door exactly, because it was locked and she no longer had a key, but the gate latch on the side yard, and then footsteps on the gravel path along the house. Then she appeared around the corner, coming from the driveway side, and she stopped when she saw him. He kept sanding. The sandpaper moved in slow, even strokes along the grain of the wood, the way his father had taught him. Never across the grain, always with it, patience more than pressure. She looked different, thinner than he remembered, with something tight behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was dressed well. She was always dressed well. It was one of the consistent things about her, the careful attention to how she presented herself to the world. But there was a quality to her appearance that reminded him of effort, of careful construction, the way people dress when they want to communicate something specific. She had come here prepared. This was not an impulse. Wade registered all of this and continued sanding. "You didn't tell me," she said. Wade set the sandpaper down. He straightened up slowly and looked at her. "Tell you what, about the inheritance. About Harold. You left," he said. She crossed her arms. Her jaw moved slightly, the way it always did when she was reordering an argument. "You still should have told me." "Why?" She didn't answer that directly. She moved closer, stepping onto the porch deck, and Wade didn't stop her, but he didn't move to make room either. He stood where he was, at the railing, with the lake behind him. She looked around the porch. The new siding on the back of the house. The dock lights that glowed amber against the evening water. He had done the renovation simply, practically, using what needed using and nothing more. But it looked different from the way it had looked when she left, and her eyes were cataloging the difference. "You renovated?" she said. "I had time." She turned back to him. Her voice shifted, became softer, the way voices shift when the speaker is attempting to change emotional terrain. "Wade, we were married for 15 years. I was your wife." "You were," he said. "Then you filed for divorce while I was in a hospital bed." I panicked. He looked at her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accelerate. He said what was true in the same measured tone he used for everything. "No, you calculated. You stood in that room and calculated, and you decided I was worth more to you divorced than healed." She opened her mouth, closed it. "I was wrong," she said, and her voice was different now. Lower, reaching for sincerity the way hands reach for something that keeps sliding away. "You were," Wade said. but not in the way you mean. He picked up the sandpaper. He turned back to the railing. After a moment, he heard her footsteps retreat across the deck and around the corner of the house. He heard her car start on the driveway. He heard it pull away. The lake reflected the last of the copper light, and the dock lights came on automatically as the sky darkened, and the bullfrogs started their conversation out near the reeds. Wade kept working on the railing. The papers arrived at the shop 2 weeks later. Calvin brought them in from the mailbox with the rest of the morning delivery, set them on Wade's desk without comment, and went back to the work floor. He had seen the return address. He understood what it was. Wade read them at his desk with his coffee going cold beside him. Brandy's attorney was a man from Fort Smith named Philip Hale, who practiced in a larger firm and whose stationery had the clean confidence of someone accustomed to winning. The filing alleged 3 things: that Brandy had sacrificed career opportunities in order to support the marriage, that she had suffered emotional distress, and that she had contributed substantially to the growth of Wade's business. Wade read each paragraph once. He set the papers down. He drank the cold coffee. He called Dana Whitlock. She read the filing that afternoon and called him back before 5. "This is the play I expected," Dana said. Her voice was steady. She was never alarmed, which was one of the things Wade valued most about her. "She's going after spousal support. She can't touch the inheritance directly as long as you've kept it separate, so she's trying a different door." "The business was already established before we married," Wade said. "I know, and that's documented. The LLC was filed in 2006. We got married in 2008. Good." There was the sound of papers. "The emotional distress claim is theatrical. The career opportunity claim. Did she have a career when you married?" "She worked part-time retail. She opened a boutique about 4 years in. I funded it. It closed 2 years later." "Who funded the startup costs?" "I did. All of it. All of it." There was a pause. "Wade, she has very little to stand on here." "I know that," he said. "I need her to know it in court." Dana's response was a short silence, and then, "I didn't think you'd want to settle." "Not for $1, he said. "All right, we'll respond to the filing this week and set for a hearing. In the meantime, keep your finances clean. Nothing moves. Nothing's moved." "Good man," Dana said. He sat at his desk after the call. Through the office window, he could see Calvin and the 2 other guys working in the bay, the sound of a wrench on metal, the low pulse of a radio playing country music, the ordinary and completely satisfying noise of shop doing its work. He had built this, board by board and hour by hour, starting with a rented space and second-hand tools, a single hydraulic lift he had bought off a closing marina in Broken Bow for $3,000 that had taken him 18 months to save. He had worked evenings after the day job, weekends, every available hour in the first 3 years, until the shop was standing on its own, until he could quit the day job and put his full weight into it. He had built a reputation the only way a reputation gets built, by doing good work consistently, by being straight with customers, by charging fairly, by fixing what needed fixing the first time. He had done all of that before Brandy was ever part of his life. She had arrived when the foundation was already poured, moved into the life he had made, and spent 15 years treating the comfort of it as though it were air, present and necessary, but unremarkable, taken in without acknowledgement. He had never resented giving her a good life. He had resented, quietly, the way the giving was never acknowledged, only noted as insufficient when it temporarily fell short. A man can build a good life for a long time on the satisfaction of the work itself. But there's a particular kind of fatigue that settles in when the person sharing that life never looks at it and says, "This is good. This is real. You did something here." He had lived with that fatigue for years and called it marriage. He went back to work. What Wade knew about Colton Rivas he had gathered gradually through the reliable intelligence network of a small town. Colton was 44, had run a contracting business out of DeQueen, Arkansas, before relocating to McCurtain County 3 years earlier. He had a reputation for charming clients and under-delivering on timelines. He drove loud, dressed loud, and occupied whatever room he was in the way some men do, loudly, with a constant low-level aggression that passed for confidence until you spent enough time around it to recognize what it actually was. There's a kind of man who seems big in a small room and gets smaller as the room gets larger. Wade had known a few of them over the years. Men who were good at the opening of things, the handshake, the first drink, the big talk at the restaurant bar, but who dissolved when the situation required something real and consistent. Colton Rivas was that kind of man. Wade had understood this without ever meeting him, simply from listening to the specific texture of what people said about him. There's a difference in how people describe a man they respect and a man they're impressed by, and everything Wade heard about Colton fell into the second category. He had prior assault charges. Wade knew this from Dana, who had pulled the record as part of her research on the case. A 2019 incident in Sevier County. Charges eventually reduced, no conviction, but the record was there. Calvin updated Wade through the spring weeks with what was moving through the town's informal channels. Colton was losing at the poker games in Idaho. Real money, consistent money. He was drinking more at the restaurants on Broken Bow's main strip, the kind of drinking that starts friendly and ends loud. Brandy had apparently started pressuring him about her court case, about the money she expected to win, about a plan she had constructed in her mind where she walked out of McCurtain County Courthouse with a settlement that let them move to Dallas and start over. Wade understood the logic of that plan from the inside. Brandy had always needed a next chapter to be forming before she could tolerate the one she was in. It was a quality that had made her exciting in the early years. She was always planning something, always reaching toward something. And it was a quality that had become exhausting in the later ones, when he recognized that the reaching was never satisfied, that every arrival became a new departure, that no version of their life was ever quite the version she had imagined was coming. Dallas. He heard that specific detail from Calvin, who had heard it from Colton himself, spoken loudly enough at a restaurant bar to be overheard by 3 people. In late May, the neighbors on Pine Ridge called the police. The report was brief and clinical, the way police reports always are. Officers responded to a disturbance call. Upon arrival, observed bruising on the complainant's right arm consistent with grabbing. Both parties interviewed on scene. Subject placed in custody. Colton spent 2 days in the county jail and was released on bond. Wade heard about the arrest from Dana the morning after it happened. She had a contact in the sheriff's office, and this kind of information was professionally relevant to the case. Wade said nothing when she told him. Dana said, "This doesn't help her, if that's what you're wondering." I figured, Wade said. It speaks to the environment she chose and the judgment she exercised when she decided this relationship was worth throwing away a 15-year marriage. She paused. I'm not saying she deserved it. Neither am I, Wade said. Nobody deserves that. But in a courtroom, Dana continued carefully, it becomes part of a larger picture. After the arrest, Colton's behavior changed in the specific way it does when a man with a temper has been humiliated in a public way and has no healthy outlet for the shame. He started blaming Brandy for the situation, the case, the scrutiny, the money problems, the pressure. You're the one who's been chasing money, he had apparently told her. These words also circulated because Pine Ridge had thin walls and neighbors who were paying close attention by this point. Brandy, to her credit or perhaps to her habit, showed up to every court-related meeting dressed impeccably. She wore confidence like armor, but the armor was starting to show wear at the edges, if you knew where to look. Wade didn't take satisfaction in this the way people might have expected. He didn't feel vindicated when he heard about the arrest, or the shouting, or the way Colton's operation had started fraying at the seams. He felt something closer to a tired, clear-eyed recognition. He had known Brandy for 15 years. He knew how she read people, selectively, looking for what they could offer her rather than who they actually were. She had looked at Colton and seen potential. She had not looked long enough or clearly enough to see the rest. That was not his problem. His problem was the courtroom, and the courtroom was coming. McCurtain County Courthouse sat at the center of Idaho like a statement, brick and old and deliberate, the kind of building that was put up with the intention of lasting longer than the people who built it. Inside, the air carried the compressed smell of old paper and floor wax, and something else, something harder to name, the specific weight of accumulated consequence. Wade had been in this building once before, years ago, for a business permit matter. It had felt different then. bureaucratic and slightly tedious. He had waited on a wooden bench, filled out a form, spoken to a clerk who didn't look up. It had felt like a minor inconvenience in a productive day. It felt different the way everything feels different when the thing on the line is your own life. The night before the hearing, Wade had slept adequately, which he took as a good sign. He was not a man who lost sleep over things he could not control, and he had done everything he could control: the documentation, the accounts, the preparation with Dana, the careful year of making clean decisions. Whatever happened in that courtroom would happen from a position of complete integrity, and that was all he knew how to do. He woke at 5, made coffee, sat on the back porch in the dark for an hour while the lake made its quiet sounds, and then dressed and drove to Idable in the early morning light. He arrived early. Dana had advised him to arrive early, to be seated and composed when the other party entered, and he had followed her advice without question because Dana's advice had proven reliable at every step. He wore a dark gray suit and a plain tie. He had bought the suit 3 days earlier at a men's shop in Idable because everything he owned from the last time he needed a suit was either too old or from a different version of his life. The new suit fit well across the shoulders, which had taken some finding given the healing asymmetry from the injury. He sat at the plaintiff's defense table with his hands folded on the surface and watched the room fill. Calvin was in the gallery. He sat in the second row with the careful neutrality of a man who has come to support a friend and knows how to be still and quiet about it. He caught Wade's eye once, nodded once, and that was all that needed to happen. Brandy entered at 8:52. She was dressed in a dark blazer and a cream blouse, her hair perfectly arranged, her posture deliberate. She was a beautiful woman, and she knew it, and she had always known how to use that knowledge in a room. She moved to the plaintiff's table without looking at Wade, took her seat beside her attorney, and arranged herself with the practiced composure of someone who had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Philip Hale opened for the plaintiff in a smooth, empathetic tenor. He painted a picture of a woman who had devoted 15 years of her life to a marriage, who had set aside her own ambitions, who had supported her husband's business through difficult years only to find herself cast adrift when circumstances changed and the money arrived. He described the inheritance as a marital windfall that changed the power dynamic of the divorce. He described Brandy as deserving of stability after sacrifice. It was skilled work. Wade gave him credit for it. Dana Whitlock rose when it was her turn. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She simply stood at the front of the room with the file open in her hands and spoke with the quiet precision of someone who has already read every document in the courthouse twice. Ms. Turner filed for divorce on October 9th of last year, Dana said. On that date, Mr. Turner was a patient in McCurtain Memorial Hospital recovering from injuries sustained while saving the life of a minor employee. He had been hospitalized for 3 weeks at the time of filing. She paused to let that settle. Ms. Turner's stated grounds, as recorded in the initial filing, cited her husband's inability to provide financially due to the injury. The room was not loud, but there was a shift in it, the specific shift of a group of people recalibrating what they had been told. Dana continued, "We will demonstrate that the inheritance Mr. Turner received from his uncle, Harold Turner, was received 3 days after the divorce was filed, was never commingled with marital assets, and constitutes separate property under Oklahoma statute. We will also demonstrate that the business Mr. Turner operates was established 2 years prior to the marriage, and that Ms. Turner made no documented financial contributions to its operation." She closed the folder. "We asked the court to find accordingly." She sat down. Wade kept his hands flat on the table. His breathing was even. Brandy took the stand at 10:15. She moved to it with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this walk. Composed, deliberate, each step measured. She adjusted her jacket before sitting. She folded her hands on the rail in front of her. She looked out at the room with the open, earnest expression of a woman who wants to be believed, and there was real skill in it. Wade had always known she was good at this, at presenting herself as the reasonable one, the deserving one, the person who had tried harder and suffered more. She had turned it on him across 15 years, and it had worked for a long time, and it was working now on certain faces in the gallery. Her attorney walked her through the narrative they had built, the devoted years, the choices set aside, the emotional investment, the sudden awareness of the inherited wealth, and the feeling that she had been excluded from something she had earned through partnership. She was composed. She had practiced this. Her voice carried the careful emotion of someone who has rehearsed the volume they want their feelings to have. Dana let Philip Hale finish without objection. Then she rose. She approached the witness stand without notes, with only a single folder she held closed at her side. She moved without hurry, which was in itself a form of pressure, the unhurried certainty of someone who already knows how this conversation ends. Ms. Turner, Dana began, you testified that you supported Mr. Turner financially during the marriage. Is that correct? Yes. Brandy's voice was steady. In my own way. In your own way, Dana repeated, not mockingly, thoughtfully, as though she was genuinely considering the phrase. She opened the folder and removed a stapled document. I'm submitting these tax returns, Ms. Turner, for the years 2010 through 2022. Each return is jointly filed, and each reflects that Mr. Turner's income from the shop constituted 100% of the household income. Is it your signature on each of these filings? Brandy looked at the documents. Her jaw moved slightly. Yes. And your income, as reported on each of these returns, can you describe it? I had the boutique. For 2 years. Dana flipped to a specific page. The boutique was open from 2012 to 2014. Is that correct? Yes. And the startup capital for that boutique, the lease deposit, the inventory, the initial operating costs, who provided those funds? A pause. Wade contributed. Fully. Brandy's hands were flat on the edge of the witness box. He helped. Dana turned to the judge with calm clarity. Bank records on file indicate Mr. Turner made a direct transfer of $28,000 to an account solely in Ms. Turner's name, described in contemporaneous documentation as startup funding for the business. I asked the court to note that documentation. Brandy's attorney objected to something in the framing. The judge considered it and overruled. Dana came back. You also testified, Ms. Turner, that you moved out of the marital home after the divorce filing due to Mr. Turner's inability to meet financial obligations. Is that your characterization? I moved out because the situation was untenable. How soon after you filed did you move in with Mr. Rivas? The room was very quiet. Brandy's voice was slightly smaller than it had been. Within a few weeks. Weeks, Dana confirmed. And Mr. Rivas, are you aware that he has prior assault charges in Sevier County, Arkansas, from 2019? Hale rose. Objection. Relevance. The judge studied his papers. Overruled. Ms. Whitlock, keep it connected. Yes, Your Honor. Dana turned back to the witness. Are you aware of those charges? That's not relevant to me, Brandy said. Her voice had sharpened. Mr. Rivas was also arrested for domestic assault in McCurtain County in May of this year, Dana said. You were the complainant in that report. The silence that followed was total. That speaks to the circumstances you chose, Dana said, measured and precise. After leaving a 15-year marriage to a man recovering from injuries sustained in an act of genuine physical courage. She closed the folder. No further questions. Brandy's face was composed in the way a face is composed when it is working very hard at composure. Her eyes were bright. She looked, for the first time since entering the room, like a woman who understood that things were not going the way she had planned. The recess came at noon. Wade ate a sandwich in Dana's car in the parking lot because they both agreed the courthouse cafe was not the right environment. Dana reviewed her notes. She had the quiet, focused energy of someone entering the most important part of the work. Colton Rivas was subpoenaed, she said between bites of her own lunch. Financial transfers. He moved money through Brandy's account twice in February, probably to shield it from his creditors. Wade set down the sandwich. You think he'll cooperate? Colton Rivas is a man who loves himself above all other considerations, Dana said. He has felony charges pending for the idle assault. He has gambling debts with people who are not patient. And he has been told, quietly, by his own attorney, that his cooperation in this matter could be discussed with the prosecutor's office. She took a drink of water. He'll cooperate. Wade nodded. I need you to be very still in that room when he testifies, Dana said. Don't react. Whatever he says. I'll be still, Wade said. I know you will, she said, and returned her notes. Colton Rivas entered the courtroom at 2:15. He looked different from how Wade had always pictured him based on Calvin's description. He was thinner than he should have been for his size, with the specific leanness of a man who had been under sustained stress, and he moved with a controlled caution that didn't match the loud, aggressive energy he apparently brought to restaurants and driveways. He wore a plain suit that didn't fit him well, and his hair was neatly combed, the effort of presentation making him look, somehow, more uncertain rather than less. He took the oath. He answered the financial questions from Hale's attorney. The account transfers, the dates, the amounts, with the clipped efficiency of someone answering from memory rather than understanding. He was cooperative in a mechanical way. Then Dana stood. She walked him through it slowly. When had he met Brandy Turner? What was the nature of their conversations regarding the divorce? Had they discussed Mr. Turner's family? Colton answered each question with the minimum necessary words. Dana came to the center question from the side, the way experienced attorneys approach the thing they've been building toward. Mr. Rivas, did Ms. Turner ever discuss with you the possibility that Mr. Turner might come into money? Colton's eyes moved, just briefly. He glanced toward Brandy at the plaintiff's table, and Brandy's expression did not change, but something in her stillness became more rigid. Yes, Colton said. Can you tell the court what she said? He was quiet for a moment. Around him, the courtroom was completely still, the kind of still that happens when a room of people simultaneously understands that something significant is about to be said. She told me his uncle was sick, Colton said. His voice was flat, without anger now, just the gray flatness of a man who had decided to let something go. She said once the old man died, Wade would be rich. She said she'd go back and get her share. He paused. She said she'd already planned it. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. It felt longer. In those 3 seconds, Wade sat completely still at the defense table with his hands flat on the surface, watching the room. He saw the judge write something. He saw one of the gallery spectators, someone he didn't know, lean toward the person beside them. He saw Philip Hale close his eyes for exactly 1 beat. He did not look at Brandy. He didn't need to. Dana thanked the witness. She returned to her seat with the unhurried composure of a woman who had just placed the last piece of a structure she had been building for months. Brandy's face, when Wade finally allowed himself to glance at it, was very pale. She was looking at the table in front of her. She was not looking at Colton, who was being escorted back to his seat. She had believed, apparently, that a man who had once looked at her the way Colton had looked at her would protect her, even when protecting her cost him. She had misunderstood the nature of what they had. Colton had loved what she offered him. He had never loved her enough to take a hit for it. That was a thing she would have to carry. Not Wade's problem. The judge was a measured man named Hargrove who had been on the McCurtain County bench for 14 years. He had the temperament of someone who has heard every version of every human story and has learned to look for what is actually there rather than what is being performed for him. He delivered his ruling the next morning. No spousal support. No claim on the inheritance. Brandy was responsible for her own legal fees. The ruling was thorough and clear, citing Oklahoma inheritance law, the documented timeline of the divorce filing relative to the inheritance, the absence of any financial contribution for Brandy to the premarital business, and the sworn testimony of Colton Rivas, which had established the strategic nature of the original filing. Wade sat and listened to every word. He did not exhale or loosen or let anything out. He simply absorbed it, the way you absorb information that confirms what you already knew was true, but needed confirmed anyway. He thanked Dana quietly as the room began to clear. She shook his hand with both of hers, a brief, firm contact that communicated everything that needed to be said between professionals who had worked together well. Outside the courthouse, a small local news crew from a Tulsa station had set up near the entrance. The reporter was young, holding a mic with careful seriousness. She asked Wade for a statement. He stopped on the courthouse steps. The June morning was warm, and the sky was a bright, clear blue, and the trees along the courthouse lawn were full and green and moving lightly in a breeze that came off the east. He could smell cut grass from somewhere nearby and the faint mineral smell that comes before summer rain. A pair of mockingbirds were working through their repertoire in the oak at the edge of the parking lot, completely indifferent to the courthouse and everyone coming out of it. Wade looked at the reporter. He considered the question. He had thought about what he might say if this moment came, not extensively, not as preparation for performance, but in the idle way the mind works through possibilities when it has quiet time. "I wish her peace," he said, "but not at my expense." He walked to his truck. He put the windows down on the drive back to Broken Bow, and the June air moved through the cab, warm and green and full of the particular smell of McCurtain County in early summer, pine resin and creek water and the dark earth of the Ouachita foothills. He drove the county road rather than the highway, the long way around through the shade of the big trees, because he was in no hurry. He had nowhere to be except back to the work. And the work was good. Brandy came out a few minutes later. He didn't see it, but Calvin did. Calvin told him later, as they stood at the edge of the work floor that evening with cold drinks, that she had come through those courthouse doors alone, that she had stopped on the steps and looked toward the parking lot, and the news crew had approached her, and she had shaken her head and walked to her car. And Colton's truck was not in the lot. Colton was not anywhere nearby. He had pleaded to a reduced assault charge 3 days before the hearing, spoken to the prosecutor's office about his testimony, and then packed what he needed from the Pine Ridge apartment while Brandy was in court. By the time she walked out of that courthouse, he was already gone. The year that followed moved with the particular momentum of a life that has been cleared of obstruction. There's a particular kind of freedom that arrives not when things are given to you, but when the weight of what was false is finally lifted, and Wade felt it in the practical, daily texture of his work and his mornings and his choices. Not euphoria, nothing as dramatic as that. Something quieter and more durable. The sense of a man operating inside his own life without interference. Wade expanded the shop. He had been planning it for years, quietly, running the numbers in his head during slow evenings and early mornings, knowing what the space could become at the right investment and the right people. Now he had both. He added a full-service marine diagnostic center to the existing repair operation, brought in new equipment, and expanded the bay to accommodate larger vessels. The lake business was there. It had always been there. And with a properly equipped facility, he could capture work that had previously gone to shops in Broken Bow's larger neighbors. He hired 3 veterans. This was not a gesture or a strategy. It was a specific choice he had made deliberately. He had grown up around men who served, and he understood something about the particular difficulty of the transition back to civilian work, the structure, the discipline, the need for work that is real and physical and has clear outcomes. His shop provided all of that. He hired from the Fort Hood Transition Program through a contact Dana had connected him with, and the 3 men he brought on were excellent at the work and settled into the shop's rhythm as though they had always been there. He also started a training program for high school students. This came from the experience with Denny, his teenage employee who had been on the dock the day of the explosion. Denny had come back to the shop 6 months after the accident, nervous and unsure of whether he was welcome, hat in his hands, standing in the shop entrance on a Thursday afternoon like a man who expects to be sent away. Wade had looked up from the engine he was examining, said simply, "You're late. Get your coveralls," and that had been the entire conversation. Denny had grinned, the involuntary, relieved grin of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has just been told to set it down, and gone to his locker. Wade had never told him he was glad he was alive. He didn't need to. Denny understood it in the way that men who work together understand things, through the job that was offered, through the steady normalcy of being put to work, through the trust implied by the lack of drama. Watching Denny develop real skills over the following months had been one of the quiet satisfactions of the year. The training program formalized what had been informal. 3 evenings a week, 2 students at a time, learning the fundamentals of marine engine mechanics. Wade ran the first sessions himself, walking students through the basics with the patient, precise instruction of a man who has broken down complex systems so many times that he knows exactly where the confusion lives and how to clear it. Eventually, as the veterans settled into their roles, Two of them took over the teaching evenings with their own brand of clear, no-nonsense instruction that the students responded to better than Wade had expected. The school district sent a thank you letter. Wade pinned it to the bulletin board in his office and did not look at it again after that, because it was the work that mattered, not the acknowledgement. The shop had a different energy now. Busier. Fuller. It sounded different. More voices, more machines, the specific productive noise of a place that is being used to its capacity. Calvin managed the floor with the same steady authority he had always had, except now he had real help and the work was organized the way it should be. Wade arrived every morning before anyone else and stayed as long as the work required and drove home along the lake road in the evening with the windows down and the radio low. He heard from Colton Rivas once more through the news. In the fall, Colton violated the terms of his probation in a way the McCurtain County Prosecutor's Office found comprehensively unambiguous. He was sentenced to 2 years. The news reached Wade through Calvin, who mentioned it on a Tuesday morning the same way. He mentioned everything, briefly, without drama. "Rivas is in," Calvin said. "Okay," Wade said, and they went back to work. Brandy's arc completed itself with the quiet collapse of a life built on borrowed assumptions. The apartment on the east side of town went empty in October, her lease not renewed. A woman who worked at the post office mentioned to her cousin, who mentioned to Calvin that Brandy had moved her things to Arkansas, to her sister's house in a small town outside Fort Smith. Her boutique, which she had attempted to reopen after the court case, funded by what? Wade never learned and didn't ask, closed before it made it through the year. The sign came down. The space was released to a sporting goods supply company. Wade did not feel satisfaction at any of this. He had expected to perhaps. He had imagined there might be a moment when the news of her difficulties landed with some compensatory weight, some evening of the ledger. Instead, when news came, he received it and filed it away and kept moving, because the work was real and his life was full, and the score had long since been settled in a room that smelled like floor wax and old paper. The evening in late September when Calvin asked him about the phone calls, they were standing on the dock behind Wade's house. The sun had been down for half an hour. The dock lights were on, casting their amber reach across the dark water. Somewhere across the lake, the sound of a boat engine moved through the dark, distant, domestic, someone heading in for the night. The air smelled like pine and water and the cool beginning of autumn. Wade had a cup of coffee. Calvin had a beer. They were not talking about anything in particular, which is the specific comfort of a friendship between men who don't need to fill silence. "She ever try calling?" Calvin asked. His voice was casual, careful, the voice of a man who has wanted to ask something for a while. "Twice," Wade said. Calvin turned his can slowly in his hands, looking out at the water. "You answer?" "No," Wade said. Calvin nodded. He didn't push it further. He understood, which was why he was standing here and not somewhere else. Wade drank his coffee and looked at the lake. The surface was very still, catching the dock lights and pulling them down into the dark water in long amber lines. The 2 phone calls had come 2 weeks apart. Both times he had seen the number and held the phone in his hand for a moment, feeling nothing dramatic. No pull, no temptation, no particular satisfaction in not answering. Just a clear and simple recognition that there was nothing to be gained from the conversation. Whatever she needed to say had been said in a courtroom under oath, through attorneys, through the formal and public accounting of a 15-year marriage. There was no version of a phone call that added anything honest to that record. He had set the phone back down both times and returned to whatever he was doing. He was not angry. The anger had burned down sometime during those quiet months of physical therapy and early morning planning, somewhere between the hospital and the courtroom, somewhere between learning his uncle's name on a note paper and watching Dana Whitlock close a folder on a Thursday morning in June. He was not sad. Sadness requires longing, requires the sense that something good was taken. What he had recognized, gradually, through the whole long year of it, was that what had been in his house was not what he had believed it to be. He had loved a version of Brandy Turner that may not have existed in the precise form he had constructed in his mind. He had loved the idea of her loyalty, the idea of their life together. He had maintained that idea for 15 years with the same steady discipline he brought to everything else, and it had not made the idea true. He held no bitterness toward her for not being who he needed her to be. Bitterness is a conclusion that someone else owed you something they failed to deliver. He didn't believe she had owed him transformation. She was who she was long before she was his wife, and he had chosen not to see it clearly, or had seen it and believed the softer version. That was on him. He held her completely accountable for every choice she made when she showed him who she was. The hospital room, the calculated timing, the courtroom performance, the years of treating his work as a given and his character as ordinary. Those were choices made with a functioning mind, and they had consequences. Those are different things. He understood that now in a way he hadn't before, and the understanding was its own kind of cleanness, its own kind of arrival. The boat engine across the lake went quiet. Someone home for the night. Broken bough settled into itself around him. The old pines standing dark against a sky thick with stars. The lake holding its stillness. The town going about its quiet life in the distance. He had been born into this place, and he had built something real inside it, and he had survived the specific kind of damage that comes not from metal and shrapnel, but from the inside of a hospital room on an October afternoon. He was still here. The shop was full. The dock lights were on. The water was calm. Some men would have called that peace. Wade Turner would have called it simply what remained when you refused to surrender what was yours. Not the money, not the shop, not the house on the lake, but the harder thing. The thing Brandy had seen in his face when she placed those papers on the tray and waited for him to break, and found instead that he had nothing left to break, because he had already decided what he was made of. She didn't lose because he hated her. She had never been able to make him hate her, which may have been the final thing that surprised her. She lost because she had spent 15 years next to a man who built things that lasted, and she had looked at what he built and seen only what it was worth, and never understood that worth and value are not the same thing. And she never would. That was her price. Wade finished his coffee. He said good night to Calvin and walked back up the dock toward the house, and the lights of Broken Bow Lake spread out behind him in every direction, amber and still and permanent, the way certain things stay when everything uncertain has finally gone.